transition into dealing with something else. I strongly believe this is impacting our mental health on various levels. And I just want you to talk a little bit more about, some of these political systems that we see in place that are, have that oppressive history of Africans in America. Like, how have they contributed to that?
Yeah, sure. I think what we're struggling with just in general as a community is knowing that we're oppressed. We know that we're oppressed. We know that there's a long history behind that oppression, but the general American public doesn't understand that. Yes. And also the exhaustion behind feeling as if we need to convince people of our humanity or to teach them, which we live the oppression. It's not our responsibility to teach other people about the oppression that they inflict upon us.
Yes.
It's also not other people's place to tell us how we should protest that oppression that has been inflicted upon us. But we know that there's like a very, very long history behind how we got to where we are today. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what so many people are missing within and outside of our community, thinking about the historical realities, right? What has happened? So first and foremost, let me say that any conversation that we have, to me is going to be surface level, because I always want to direct people to the book. So I will absolutely give a book list when we are done this for people to really read and expand their mind. But just quickly, I want us to think about specifically, we talk about the policing. And policing is directly connected to the prison industrial complex and how we got here. So I was having a conversation recently with someone where I was trying to draw the connection between enslavement to convict leasing to the modern day prison industrial complex. And we know the reason why, one of the many reasons why we see black and brown folks being incarcerated at a disproportionate rate is due to that connection. So black people were brought to America to provide free labor. That free labor became the base of the US economy. Black bodies were worth more to the United States in 1776 than all of the money in the banks combined. So many of the same Fortune 500 companies that we use today got started with slavery. In the 19th century, US banks and southern states would sell securities that helped fund the expansion of slave-run plantations. Since it was a dangerous business, insurance policies were purchased. These policies protected against things like the boats used to transport enslaved Africans and the risk of losing individual slaves once they got to America. People also would, before I'll be enslaved, I will jump off the side of the ship. And as far as those who were the enslavers, they wanted to get their property insured. So some of the largest insurance firms in the United States, we're talking New York Life, AIG, Aetna, sold policies that ensured slave owners would be compensated if the slaves they owned were injured or killed. Moreover, the money Southern plantation owners earned was deposited in U.S. banks, like J.P. Morgan, subsidiaries. They accepted enslaved people as collateral for loans. So plantation owners defaulted on a loan payment. The banks took ownership of these enslaved humans. Also, keep in mind, this was not a business solely relegated to the South. So New England merchants made money selling commodities to the South and the Caribbean. And in turn, Northern merchants bought raw cotton and sugar. So New England's fabric mills played a key role in the U.S. industrial evolution.
Wow.
The supply of cotton came from the slave-reliant South. So brands like Brooks Brothers turned Southern-based enslaved cotton into high-end fashion. So it's those type of connections with how it's with us today. But what's most interesting here is that those who were laboring for free for centuries to contribute to the economy that we have today, as well as these major companies, we never received any compensation for our labor. Especially important when we think about how we translate quote unquote wealth. When I hear conversations in our community, we got to translate black wealth, and it's kind of this very surface level conversation. And I'm just like, so you want to dismantle capitalism? That's what we're really talking about, because these things can't be separated. So one of the main ways people translate wealth in this country is through private property. But black people have been private property longer than we've been able to own private property, and that's what so many people are missing. Again, just saying that to say, one of the main ways slavery is still relevant with us in the 21st century is the connection between our enslavement and private property, which is why I'm telling people and it's an uncomfortable conversation, right? We love the Beyoncés, the Jay-Z's, oh, it's a billionaire list. But I'm like, yo, we really need to dig a lot deeper in terms of how this system was structured. And it's not enough to just have Black faces in high places. It's about deconstructing this history. And again, we can take this conversation about enslavement, which, is supposed to have been gone by the 13th, with the 13th Amendment, but people forget there's a clause in the 13th Amendment. And that clause said, basically slavery, is no longer legal here unless you are considered a criminal. But of course, we know that came with the rise of the Black codes. Black codes, for those who might not know, were the laws that are essentially like, if you're loitering, you can be considered a criminal. If you are, you don't have a job, you can't show us papers, you're considered a criminal. And once you're a criminal, we can then lease you out to the same plantation owners, the same textile mills, et cetera, for you to labor for us for free. And we see convict leasing happening from 1865 all the way until the 1940s. And then, of course, we see the rise of what? The prison industrial complex, which, again, they essentially get paid to have a bed in the body, or have bodies in those beds in those prisons. And we saw tons of prosecutors, judges, eventually get caught and get in trouble, a lot of whom didn't, but some did, for throwing the book, to these young Black teenagers for offenses that they shouldn't have gotten the maximum sentence, but they knew they were going to make money. So Honeywell, AT&T, Victoria's Secrets, there are literally thousands. I'm talking like 4,000 different companies that are making money off of enslaved labor in the prison industrial complex. And I'm calling it enslaved labor still because they're being paid 40 cents an hour to do that labor. And what people don't understand, they should really be upset about this. The same folks were like, oh, people, other minorities are quote unquote taking our jobs. And it's just like, no, the people who are running these corporations done gave your jobs to the enslaved folks that are working for 40 cents an hour to make these products. Like it's a changing scene. And I could go on about this forever, but their minimum and pick up if they haven't already. Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. That's one of many books that talks about this. I also have a bunch of recommendations for books that tie in the connection between enslavement, African slavery to capitalism. And of course, those things are also tied to imperialism, which is another conversation that I want to push our followers to understand, that we need to understand these things, not just from a domestic aspect, but from a global aspect. And a lot of the same leaders that we look up to, even though the Black radical tradition says that we shouldn't focus on just one big charismatic leader. But a lot of the people that, our community looks up to, they were global in their strategies, global, understanding oppressions all over the place. So let me stop rapping.
Ladies and gentlemen, Brittany Lewis, make sure y'all follow her. Make sure you can catch her on Roland Martin, Fox 5 DC, all that stuff. I love it, Brittany.
I do want to, I got tons of questions for you, because first off, I know you know. One of the things that I did want to ask you, and I keep seeing quite a bit in the news, when we're talking about defunding the police, people are like, well, I want the police to come. I feel, certain people are like, well, they still need to be around for certain things. And I think one of the easiest examples to point to in terms of why police are not trained to be social workers, to be mental health advocates, et cetera, is we see the police among some of the many reasons why people end up being shot and killed. We see them being shot and killed due to mental health issues that police aren't able to readily identify. So I would love to hear your thought process around that.
No, that's such a great question, Brittany. So before I answer that really quickly, can you give us a brief synopsis of what defunding the police means? Because I'm hearing a lot of conversation about it, and it seems like some people don't have a clear understanding of what that actually entails and what that will look like. So if you can do us a favor and just kind of clarify what those parameters will look like.
So a few things. So we know that the issues that arise in our communities are typically a result of a lack of funding for social welfare programs. So funding the police means reducing police budgets and power on a local and state level and investing that money directly into poor communities of color. Reforming the police historically has not worked. We've done so many procedural changes. We've tried body cameras. We know body cameras, they don't have to be turned on. And even when we see footage, we know a lot of the time that police officers end up not actually being convicted for the crime. So, or even without racial justice training or racial awareness training, we know those things don't necessarily lead to our freedom either. So we're talking about literally draining the money from the police departments and putting it into other services. So like if you get a domestic violence call, instead of a police officer showing up, you're getting someone who's trained in domestic violence. If, someone is having a mental break, you're calling a mental health professional, not a police officer, with a gun. If it's those type of things. So again, what we're seeing is public institutions being defunded while police budgets are constantly increasing. And it's like by increasing, we're not actually by sending police out or having more police in areas of high crime, you are not actually fixing the issue. You are exacerbating the issue by putting more people in the system that do not need to be in the system. If you reallocate that money to create, more economic opportunities, more jobs, if you put that money back into mental health services, social services, education reform, you're not going to have as many problems in the first place. So that's what that means to defund the police. And there is a lot of conversations about how we're defining it. So I think, in my personal opinion, I feel like the movement's actually been co-opted. People are saying, oh, we're not talking about completely defunding the police, but I really challenge people to read Angela Davis and her abolitionist stance, and to really talk about why we have to dismantle the police, because the earliest iterations of the police are directly tied to the slave patrol. People forget that the second part of is to protect and serve the interests of the ruling class, protect and serve property, which is why, when Black bodies are dying left and right extrajudicially at the hands of police or at the hands of Community Watch, nothing happens. But you start burning up property, and now you see the National Guard mobilized. But that's because, again, it's to protect the ruling class. It's to make sure the people with money and their property are safe. So again, we really need to reconsider the way in which we understand the entire system.
Right, exactly. And Brittany, I think that you educated us so eloquently on what defunding the police means. So when police officers do respond to like domestic violence or an individual who's emotionally dysregulated or unable to get their emotions under control, that can be very threatening. Number one, because police officers are pretty much operating beyond their boundaries of competence when they try to respond to some of these people's needs. If you're in a state of crisis, then you need to call mobile crisis. You need to call, someone who could respond to you from a mental health perspective. However, again, when you have police officers who are responding to these individuals with these exacerbated emotional concerns, they might not necessarily be trained in knowing how to verbally de-escalate somebody. That's why they might automatically pull out a gun if they see somebody as a threat. That's why I feel like it's very, very important for us to really understand what defunding the police means and how this can actually be a benefit to our community if we're allowing, social services and mental health workers and multiple crises and all these different areas in which our communities actually need to be funded in order to respond to these individuals. And honestly, us talking about defunding the police, that brings up another question about implicit biases, right? And so, Brittany, I know you already kind of touched on this a little bit, but, I was watching, I believe it was a national security advisor on CNN, and he talked about how there is no racism or there is no systematic racism in police departments, period. Like he said, they asked this question about 3 or 4 times, and he kept saying, no, it doesn't exist, right? So I want to ask you, and so after you respond, I'll respond, but I want to ask you, is there systematic racism? Does that exist in police departments?
We know there's systemic racism. We know that. Black people know this. We have a thing called DWB, Driving While Black. We know if we see a police officer to the right of us, we are actively not going to pass that officer. We are going to be praying on the Lord that officer. We know that we have a unique experience, and we don't need anybody outside of us to validate that. We know that. Exactly. It's interesting that people are talking about implicit bias, but the reality is this goes deep, right? We have to talk about the centuries of advertisements, media, museums that centered Black bodies, where we see Blackness as a threat. We have been dehumanized, which is why when you take a lot of these, I see a lot of white allies, use examples of, look, I'm a white woman. Take this exact same scenario and put my body in that place. Would I still be alive today to tell my story? And the answer is almost always yes, because again, Black skin alone is seen as a threat, which is why that is like the number one defense that police officers use, which is, even if this person is running from me and I'm shooting them, I have to stop the threat, right? So we have weaponized Black skin, literally, which is why I ask these questions. And these are really the difficult questions for our community when we think about, reform as how do you change someone's mind? How do you change the collective identity of a people in someone's mind?
And that's the difficult part, Brittany, because I feel like we're going to continue to experience this because we have not, we haven't reconciled that relationship, that legacy that we have with slavery. white people are continuing to deny that there's privilege. People are still continuing to deny systematic racism exists until we get to a place where we can acknowledge it, lean into it, have a discussion about it, and reconcile that history. We're going to be in the same places over and over again. And so I definitely want to address why we're seeing so many individuals say no, implicit bias doesn't exist. Number one, anyone with implicit bias isn't going to say, I have implicit biases. That's the whole definition. It's implicit. Like you're most of the time, you're not even aware that you're racist or you have these biases. However, again, once you go back and just start to kind of really acknowledge the fact that, okay, maybe I do have some biases, then we'll be able to get to a place where we can have a discussion about it and begin to dismantle it. But, I think that continuing to deny it, continuing to say it doesn't exist is going to keep us in that same repetitive cycle over and over and over again.
I think what's really important is to make sure that our community, the Black community, capital B, has a political education so that in these type of moments, we're not pushing for simple reforms. We're not really pushing for electoral politics as our solution. I know the community doesn't like when I say things like this, but at the end of the day, that means being critical of President Barack Obama. It means talking about how Black Lives Matter had happened under that administration. It means talking about Black police officers that inflict the same type of racialized violence as a result of the system. It's talking about Black folks in the National Guard. It's the system. It's not enough to just have Black faces in high places. So I think in these moments, it's so important to share a type of political education. And of course, we have our lived existential experience as Black people that's shared, that can't be, taken from anybody. But I also think it's very important for us to be reading, for us to be engaging, the works, of our elders, intergenerationally. This is something that's not new. I always kind of I get upset when I see those signs like, oh, we're not our grandparents' generation. And it's just like, first off, you are embarrassing yourself when you make comments like that, because that tells me that you actually haven't read about or know enough about your ancestors to know the various liberation tactics, the various things that they've gone through to continue to fight for us that allow us to be here in the way that we are today. So I think right now the best thing for us to do is to push beyond these boundaries of reform, not let our ideas and our liberation be co-opted by folks who really just want to do just that, go back to business as usual. And I don't know about anybody else. Yes, Trump is absolutely horrible, but I'm not trying to go back to, a country under, the previous presidency. We still had issues. We were still disproportionately affected across the board in terms of housing and incarceration. So it's not enough just to have somebody in, the national office. And don't get me wrong, I'm not telling people not to vote. That's not what I'm saying. I think at the end of the day, this is our political system. But what I am saying is it's not enough to just vote on the national level. We need to be voting on the state and local level as well. But it's also important to think and imagine beyond that. Sometimes people don't realize that the current world we're in is not how the world has always been structured. And I mean that in terms of how we understand the nation state, or like just the way in which, the country was formulated. I mean, this starts getting to some really deep stuff, and I can provide help for the listeners. But again, just thinking beyond reform and thinking about completely changing things. We've seen so many changes. This movement has been both national and global in its efforts, right? And I think it's really important for us to continue to connect the dots and push and continue to demand for something more.
Yeah. And I love the fact that we are seeing that. We're seeing that demand that you're speaking of, Brittany. I really love that. Do you have any other,
Oh, I know. I was saying for sure.
Yeah. So make sure you guys are asking questions. So you can ask questions in our comment section on Facebook, and you can submit questions on Instagram so that we can answer them for you. So Brittany's a political expert, and I have some experience in mental health. So just let us know. Yeah.
Question for you. So I feel like every Black person, we know someone who has had encounters with the police.
Yeah.
Way too many of them I know who have had guns to their head. Literally family members. I got pulled over. I looked like the suspect, quote unquote, is what I was told. They put a gun to my head. They put me on the ground. They realized I wasn't the right person. They walked away as if nothing happened. What are the long-term effects of those type of experiences?
So Brittany, there is so much research pertaining to exactly what you're talking about. So researchers have actually suggested that there are significant emotional and psychological concerns when a population of people has a history of trauma. So for instance, slavery, right? And they continue to experience racism and oppression, such as being pulled over by the police, such as, all the things that we experience, such as Jim Crow and redlining and all these different things, right? When we continue to have those experiences, it can exacerbate what we call race-based race-based traumatic stress. I'm sorry. So it's either racial trauma or race-based traumatic stress. And so I think that we're seeing a lot of this, especially given the recent events that have been happening in the nation. And race-based traumatic stress is real. I'm seeing a lot of therapists talk about it. I'm really happy that we're having these discussions, but I don't think that we've really taken the time to really assess how our current behaviors, our emotions that we demonstrate, being hypervigilant when we see police officers and other people in authority, how that is not necessarily a direct experience or a direct correlation of our personal experience, but it also is passed down from our ancestors. Like, this is transgenerational trauma. And until we get to the point where we can identify that, then healing won't be possible until we can actually reconcile that. So I think I always say we have to be intentional about our healing. That means making sure that we're going to therapy, making sure that we're addressing some of these concerns related to our emotions and our behaviors. But we have to be intentional. Like, gone are the days to where we look at these as just like, oh, that's just what Black people do. That's just what our community does. It's just something we have to get used to. No, not at all. Like, we have to look at this as a trauma. And one thing I was saying a few weeks ago in another live, I think that we look at trauma in America from like a hierarchical perspective. And what I mean by that is we don't look at sexual abuse as a trauma, but when it comes to race-based trauma, we don't treat it with the same care as an individual who is sexually abused or an individual who is held at gunpoint, right? So race-based trauma is as traumatic as these other events. That's why it's so important for us to take our emotions so very seriously.
Yo, that is such a good point. Like, even I feel like I'm guilty of this, right? Like, I can talk about all these different traumas that I've been through my childhood, et cetera, and easily be able to identify, like, yes, I need to talk to somebody about this. But what I think about, and I think so many in our community, we think about like, oh, that colleague called me this, or oh, that microaggression happened, or oh, this macroaggression, or oh, I got pulled over by the police officer. They didn't have a warrant. I told them they couldn't, but they tried to search me anyway, and I didn't want to escalate the issue. And
Right.
we just like, oh, well, that's just being Black, driving while Black.
Period.
Being Black in corporate America. I mean, it just is what it is. But without thinking about like, what are the effects of that and the coping, like you said, the coping that we go through to be able to survive. I think about that not even with policing, but when I think about when I go to the doctor's office, right? Like, I purposely, and this is horrible, right? This should not have to happen. But thinking about, okay, I know that these doctors have biases, right? And my fear as a Black woman is, if I'm not dressed a certain way, if I'm not speaking a certain way, I purposely wear university paraphernalia as if that means that potentially they'll treat me better. But what does that say, right? First off, we obviously know respectability politics aren't going to save us. No matter how much education we have, how much money we make, at the end of the day, we're still Black, and none of those things matter. But the way in which we have to try and find ways to navigate this world and survive, it's exhausting. Like, our regular day-to-day traumas, it's exhausting.
Yes, very exhausting, very exhausting. And that's why it's so important for us to really focus in on some of those thoughts that we have about it, focus in on some of the emotions that we have about it so that we can begin that healing journey. So really, I think you said a mouthful there. And you even alluded to the fact that sometimes we think that has to be our norm. But who said it has to be our norm, right? So I think that it's so important as us as individuals in the Black community for us to really pay attention to some of those things that we have normalized. Just because it became our norm, because we normalized to it, doesn't mean that it's functional.
Hello.
Right? So it doesn't mean that it's functional. It doesn't mean that it's okay. That's why it's really important for us again to continue to dismantle systematic racism and oppression and stop allowing ourselves to confine to these different behaviors and emotions. Like, it's so, and I cannot say this enough, it's so important for us to be intentional about our healing, especially in the Black community. We've experienced trauma. I said it before, I'll say it again. We didn't have a DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders, back during slavery. But I promise you, if we had one, some of our ancestors would have been diagnosed with PTSD. And somebody said it on Instagram, trauma is epigenetic. There's epigenetic research with trauma like that passed down transgenerationally. That's why it's so important for us to begin to address this.
Hello.
Period.
Hello.
Girl, like, we could talk about this all day. But somebody asked us a question. Okay, should we be targeting racism or the current structure of capitalism? So that's one of the questions that we have.
Yeah, I mean, I could take a stab at this. I don't think those things are separate. Mm-hmm. Those things are interconnected. And I think, and I don't know if that person joined a little bit later, but just talking about like the reason why we were brought here is directly connected to capitalism, right? These things can't be separated. So, which is why I say I think the most important thing is for us to further a type of political education, which is why I want to end this with some type of book list maybe that we can provide that talks about these connections. It can't be separated. It can't be seperated.
Yes. I love it. Don't forget to send us that book.
Yes, I will.
And all of that. Because listen, we need this education.
I got you for sure.
Okay, so we have so much momentum right now. How do we organize long-term to push for reform in all areas? So that's a good question.
Sheesh. Yeah, that's a multifaceted one. So how do we say it again? How do we
organize long-term to push for reform in all areas?
Well, I think there's multiple things that we can do. I think, obviously, I always go back to this political education. We need to educate ourselves fully and have a specific type of education where we as a community are able to draw the connections between capitalism, race, white supremacy, patriarchy, all the powers that be. I think that's super important. But I also think it's really important for us to, push for a more radical change. I think that we're seeing that right now, specifically around the conversations of defund the police. I think that it's also important for us to, that's such a loaded question. I think obviously, continue to participate. Granted, I do not think electoral politics is the answer, but of course to participate both local, state, and national, participate in all the elections until we have reached that further. I hate the language of progress, man, because it's like we need to demand it now. But yeah, I mean, continuing to protest, continuing to imagine a different world.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, I'm in total agreement with that.
Yeah.
Say it again. Sorry, I thought you were talking, but yeah, I'm in total agreement with that. And I love the fact that we have so much momentum right now, and I think it's so important for us to stay in this level. Okay, so I can answer the next question, and then the following one is this one from Bardic Harris from Facebook. How intentional is that question? But before that, so Krista Harris asked, how would you address this in therapy with your clients? I think that's a really great question. And again, so it's kind of loaded, but hopefully the response that I provide will be helpful. So it all depends on where your client is in terms of their racial identity. So if you have an individual who's not as progressed in their racial identity, meaning they don't know who they are in terms of their Blackness and what that means about them, then you'll address that a little differently. Like I would process their emotions a little bit more, ask them like how these situations have impacted them on an emotional level, on a cognitive level. What are some thoughts that you have about yourself? How does this influence you as a person? What does this mean about you as a Black person? And then if the individual is on the other side, if the individual is a little bit further in progress in their racial identity, you might go about things a little bit different. So when you're further progressed in your racial identity, you have a healthier sense of self, a healthier sense of who you are in terms of your Blackness, in terms of how the world sees you, in terms of your self-esteem and things of that nature. So when you do have an individual who has a strong sense of self and a strong sense of racial identity, then you might want to focus in again on the emotions and helping them to just unpack how they're feeling and help them to kind of cope with it on a level that's both rational but also addressing their emotions. But it all depends. Again, like based on your racial identity. So you can go about it in various ways. And I have some books as well. I hope that answer wasn't too complicated, but I have some books as well that I can refer. Okay, so somebody say include therapists licensed to assess on all levels to help mitigate decision making. I'm thinking you mean when we're talking about so Brittany, did you read this question on Facebook?
Girl, I can't. The technology.
Oh my
God. What's the question?
How intentional should we be? How intentional should we be with not spending our Black dollars at white establishments? So how intentional should we be?
Yeah, I think this has always been one of the many strategies within the Black community is to keep our money flowing within our community. We know that we have very, very our consumer power is astronomical, right? Like we know that. So I think it's extremely important for us to be purchasing, buying Black, and circulating that money within our community.
It's so important, Brittany. Is there anywhere that our followers, our viewers can support you in terms of like businesses or anything?
Well, I don't actually have any businesses, but people can absolutely follow me. So my Instagram is Brittany Lee Lewis. My Twitter is Britt Lee Lewis. And my Facebook is also Brittany Lewis. So anything that I have going on, any conversations that I'm having with folks, I know I post a lot of really great articles. It covers a lot of the topics that we've been talking about. And then, of course, I'll make sure to, we can collectively put together a book list that addresses a lot of the things that we've been talking about, because I'm very big on reading. I think that reading is the best tool that we have.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's so important. Yeah, I'm so proud of that. So make sure you guys follow Brittany on Instagram and Professor on Facebook. You guys know her from culinary, all the TV appearances that has made. So make sure you guys follow her. If you guys are looking to support Black, if you guys are looking to support Black, follow Minds of the Culture. Not the camera. All right, follow Minds of the Culture. Make sure that you are following Double Portion. We have some apparel there. So let's keep our dollars within our community. I'm all for it.
Love it.
Yes. Brittany, it's always a pleasure talking to you.
Likewise. Love you, sis.
Love you too. All right, girl.
All right, see you.
Thanks for tuning in, guys.